Welcome to the presentation on the chemistry of life. This for Science 9 is the beginning of a single biology unit. We will not have time to cover multiple biology units, but there is an introductory biology that Science 9 does at the end of the year, and this is part of that. So this presentation, which is part one of a four-part series, will cover a section out of a biology book. And it covers the first chapter, just a section out of that chapter about essentially what is life. And so this presentation is going to concern itself with what is life. I would encourage you to first read that section. I have provided that section to read as I think it's called Reading 1, and it's material that is available in the classroom. Also available is a set of guided notes. I encourage you to have those guided notes and fill those guided notes out as we go. And they're very similar to what we have done, where there is a word or a phrase that is missing and you can get that right from the slide. I would encourage, if you have the opportunity to, say, watch this presentation on a phone that could display YouTube or Google Classroom videos, and if you had a laptop from the school available, that you could actually have the guided notes pulled up to where you could actually just type onto the guided notes. That would be an ideal situation, but not everyone has the availability of that, or your phone will use up data or something. I mean, so it can be restrictive. But if you have the opportunity, why not take it? It seems like it might work out very well for you. Well, you should also have a student learning map, and that student learning map be interactive. There is one actually on the Google Classroom you can pull down and download for yourself, which would have text boxes and that you could actually click and type in. Otherwise, you could certainly, if you have the availability of printing things off or calling the school for a hard copy of anything, you can certainly do that and fill it out with paper and pencil. So the key learning here, biology certainly is a life science. Up till now, we have been doing what are called physical sciences, which earth science is something, it's essentially like a physical science, but it's its own thing. Biology is a life science. It is the science that employs the scientific method to studying living things. So there's your key learning. Our unit essential question, which will be on the test, I believe, is what is the chemical basis for life? The next slide. Yes, it is the section or the lesson 1 concept is life, and the lesson 1 lesson essential question is what makes something living. Now, if you find that I go too fast for you, where I read through a slide quickly or I talk through it quickly and move on, by all means, please pause, run the video back, run the presentation back to the slide that you need, pause it on that slide, get what you need, and then move forward. You could, if you wanted to, just watch it all at once and listen to the narration and get an idea of what's being said, and then go back and watch it again without the narration, just clicking on each slide or advancing your video to each slide and just writing down what you need without any audio or actually playing the video. But that's up to you on how you make this happen. I hope it's successful. Whatever you do for you, then that leads to being successful on the homework and on the test. Okay, this is where the guided notes pick up with the characteristics of life. So characteristics of life, as you see this slide, living things. Well, living things, and I do have a pen activated so I can interact with this a little bit. So starting at the very top here, living things. First of all, in order to be alive, to be considered living, living things must be made of units called cells. Some of this is probably going to seem very basic to you. Other things may be, I don't know if they're going to be surprising, but maybe something that at least you do not know. All living things must have the ability to reproduce either sexually or asexually. Now, the difference between how reproduction happens is simply sexually, where we have DNA, genetics, right, coming from at least 2 individuals that will have to combine in order to make a new organism. With asexually, 1 parent is only needed to actually give DNA to reproduce, like a plant that can bud and a new plant grows from it. A spider plant is a very good example of that, where just the spider plant alone can actually create shoots, and those shoots can become their own separate plants. That would be asexual reproduction. Otherwise, it's going to take two individuals in order to produce an organism. So the third item, based on universal genetic code, that in the blueprint in the cells in order to make a new organism is going to be found in DNA or RNA, and that genetic code would be universal for organisms. Organisms must have the ability to grow and develop in order to be considered alive. You could things that are alive are not born fully formed. There's always a period, even if it's brief, that they actually grow and develop. Organisms obtain and use materials and energy from their environment, and that is called metabolism. So that, absorb energy, we eat, we breathe, that kind of a thing. Organisms, in order to be considered alive, must be able to respond to the environment. They must be able to respond to stimuli, plural, or a stimulus, singular. A rock does not respond to the environment in any way, shape, or form, whereas organisms do. Organisms also must be able to maintain a stable internal environment, which is called homeostasis. And lastly, as a group, organisms must be able to change over time, and this is to evolve. And if it happens over a short period of time, that's called an adaptation. But over a long period of time, that's called evolving or evolution. Moving on. Okay, on your guided map, or on your guided notes again, big ideas. So the big idea here is that biology is a life science. While there are many branches of the biological sciences, we will just tend to look at biology as a whole. All aspects of biology are very much connected. One other thing that I would like you to pull off of this slide certainly is that science in general is a process for obtaining knowledge about the world around us. Science involves the gathering and analyzing of empirical data. Now, empirical is just a fancy way to say measured. Empirical data is data that has been measured. That's all that is. And this data, it comes from experiments and it comes from studies. Okay, biosphere. We have talked about the biosphere before, and now it is back, of course, because we're talking about biology. And again, all of this continues with your guided notes. So all forms, right up here at the top here, all forms of life are connected in what is called the biosphere, which we call, of course, the sphere of life. Simply mean all life on, in, or above the earth. The relationship of life in the environment relies on the flow of energy and the cycle of matter. So there is very much a cycle of matter, that matter recycles itself. Organisms are born, they grow, they live their life out, and they die. And then what makes up that organism, all of the molecules and the atoms and all the chemicals, then are broken down and dispersed back into the environment somehow, whether it's by being eaten by another animal that metabolizes all of those components, or if it just decays naturally without being eaten, which would be a bacterial action. But all of this is simply a cycle. And energy is involved in all of this. Now, energy basically can go into something, or energy can come out of something. If energy goes into something, we call that endothermic, like sunlight going into a plant, being absorbed by a plant to do photosynthesis. Or energy can come out of something, like when you run and you get very hot and your body heats up, that would be exothermic. So energy from sunlight, down here in the next one, energy from sunlight is used by plants to make chemical energy, which is how the organism can grow. All other life besides plants, actually, must obtain chemical energy from plants or other organisms that rely on plants. So everything goes all the way back to plants at pretty much the base of the food chain. And plants can make their own energy. and that they need to grow, but everything else relies upon plants or other animals or organisms that eat plants. Matter then provides nutrients in order to build body structure and to develop, which is part of what that metabolism is. Continuing on with your guided notes. Living cells, and this is just kind of more focused on each of the parts of what makes something alive. Living things are made of units called cells. Cells are the very smallest units of an organism that can be considered alive. So a cell can be considered alive. Nothing inside of the cell can be considered alive, and things that are made of cells can be considered alive. So from the cell up, it's alive. From below the cell, inside the cell, it's technically not alive. One or more cells are needed to be alive. A unicellular organism is made of one cell only, whereas a multicellular organism is made of at least two cells, if not more. And of course, in the case of blue whales and humans and gorillas and elephants and all of that, and a tree, that we are made of billions upon billions upon billions times billions upon billions upon billions of cells. Shown here, we have a single-celled organism. I'm not quite sure if that's a paramecium or a bacterial cell. And over here we have red blood cells, and I believe that's also in the middle a white blood cell, and which is I think it's called a T cell for fighting infection. And this is a group of cells called a neuron. Now, cells are amazing, amazing things. It is no surprise that a cell can actually be referred to as almost like a factory, like an industry, as far as what it takes in with raw materials, what it does with those materials on the inside, and what it does for the organism. That if it's, unless it's a one-celled organism, that cell has a function within the greater organism. And so cells are really like factories with everything that they do. Now this is a really cool image, excuse me, of a cell that has many different structures, many of which you've heard of before, like ribosomes, endoplasmic reticulum, the cell membrane, which holds everything in, mitochondrion, the cytoskeleton, the nucleus, of course, the nuclear membrane, the Golgi apparatus, and everything else. That you've heard of these things before in other classes. So the cell itself, just an amazing, amazing evolutionary structure. Cells and heredity. Here again, continuing on with your guided notes. So, cells and heredity. And I'm following along with your guided notes, so I'm making sure that I'm on the proper page. Here we are, right underneath cells. So, living things are based upon a universal genetic code, and it's amazing that all, and I mean all, life on planet Earth is based on either DNA or RNA. This is some very firm evidence that all life came from a single source back some billions of years ago. At least that's where the science points, regardless of individual belief and all kinds of different systems out there of belief. In science, we look for the evidence. What does the evidence tell us? And the evidence tells us that all life came from a single source. And otherwise, there would be no need for life to actually all be based on DNA or just a simplified DNA, which is called RNA. And there would be no need for that. What'll be really cool, and it'll be just absolutely amazing, is when we discover, and I think it's a question of just when we discover life off planet, somewhere else, whether it's on Mars or Europa or Enceladus, which is another moon, or out of the solar system. Will alien life be based on DNA or RNA, or will it have its own unique structure, its own unique chemical makeup that allows it to be alive, different from how we are? That will be an amazing day, not only when we discover that life, whether it be bacterial or all the way up to evolved and intelligent, but what will it be like? We know that all life is DNA or RNA based, and again, a firm evidence for one source only for all of that. Okay, life processes. life processes are directed by and encoded in common genetic code with only minor variations. DNA, of course, to be spelled out is deoxyribonucleic acid, or shortened up to DNA. And a more simplified version, kind of like a single-sided version of DNA, is called RNA, called ribonucleic acid. All aspects of all life are encoded in DNA. DNA is literally a blueprint. It is the genetic code to make another one of you or me or a tree or a porpoise or whatever. Interestingly, that, with genetic differentiations, thinking about DNA, all right, with a tree, okay, so here we have a tree, and here we have a person. So with a tree and with a person, we're both made of DNA. But with that DNA, basically there may be less than 15% difference between a person and a tree from the DNA standpoint. But that 15% makes all the difference in that how a tree is built and how a person is built completely different in all aspects of life. But the DNA is 85% matching. I mean, we match a tree. Amazingly, all the way up to, I think, our closest relative is a chimpanzee. Not a monkey, but a chimpanzee. And a chimpanzee, we are only, I believe, about 2.5% different in our DNA. Now that's amazing, 2.5. And look at what that difference is. Think about what a chimpanzee can do, the brightest chimpanzee on the planet, and consider what normal people can do. Just normal people, not the brightest person on the planet, but normal people. And that's what that 2.5% difference does in the DNA to our closest relative. We're actually also very close in relationship to pigs, which doesn't bother, none of this bothers me. It doesn't matter to me what I'm related to and what I'm not. But with pigs, and this is how in pigs we can actually grow organs, and we can then use pig organs or human organs, grow them in pigs, and then actually transplant them in order to help people overcome illness or injury and live longer, more productive lives. So just amazing stuff there. Okay, last thing on this slide way down here, and that is the code, the genetic code, the DNA code, is actually transferring the traits of the parents, being copied through that DNA, through that genetic code, and then passed from parent to offspring. We call this heredity. Reproduction. We've already talked about this. I think the concept is pretty understood by a lot of people. Two ways to do it. If organisms want to reproduce, there is sexual reproduction, which requires two parents in order to provide DNA, which will mix, and then it'll create offspring. Or there can be asexual reproduction, where one parent alone can copy itself to make offspring. Now, with sexual reproduction, of course, I have, up here just an image of, mother, father, I guess, and a baby, and that shows, I guess, sperm over here, egg cell over here, and then, of course, combines to make a baby. But not all organisms actually have to engage in contact, in sex, really, to actually have offspring. There are a lot of fish that actually never contact each other in order to reproduce. The female fish will lay the eggs on like a rock surface or on the bottom of the stream, and then the male fish will actually swim over the eggs and deposit the sperm. And so no contact between the two fish itself, but this is still sex. And it's still two bits of DNA actually having to mix in order to make fish offspring. Okay, with asexual reproduction, you see the plant. Plants can bud off and just make copies of themselves. There's no need for a second plant to be involved, and second plant DNA is not involved. Unity and diversity. Let's try that. Continuing with your guided notes. All living things are alike at the molecular level. Diversity of life results from simply minor differences in the genetic code that have a major impact. Remember, between us and chimps, 2.5% difference between humans and chimps. And I don't know what the percentage is, but I would be surprised if it were over 3% between humans and pigs. And I'm guessing 15%, but I think it might even be less than that between humans and, say, an oak tree. So, you know, it's amazing that there's, you know, we're so close, but yet that little slight difference is the difference between a tree, a pig, a chimp, and a human, and a blue whale, and all of that. So just amazing. Life is just absolutely amazing. Okay, all life is carbon-based, so everything is based upon, all life rather, is based upon the element carbon and the molecules that carbon can create, along with water, of course. All life uses proteins to build structure, and all life will store genetic information as either DNA or RNA. And DNA is kind of like a ladder that has been twisted. I don't know if I can draw this. Yeah, something like that. So that what they call the double helix structure, that DNA where you have two strands and they're tied together and twisted like a ladder that's been twisted. RNA is simply like half of that ladder. That's what RNA, just it's a simpler form of DNA. Evolution. Outside of science, I do know this is a controversial subject, but as far as for science, the evidence is in that things do change over time, and they change over an incredibly long period of time, and it's through typically natural selection and it can relate to survival of the fittest in many cases, not all cases. So, what is evolution? Evolution is simply changes in life over long periods of time, much longer than the lifespan of an individual. We're talking tens of years for organisms that may live, you know, a week. You know, think about it. If you live a week as an insect, 10 years is how many generations? 50 generations a year, 500 generations later. So yeah, things can certainly evolve. Think about COVID-19 that we're dealing with. That is an evolutionary difference in bacteria, or excuse me, in virus. Okay, so changes over long periods of time, tens of years for really short-lived organisms, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years for other organisms. It explains inherited similarities and differences. There is the evidence points to a common origin of life around 3.5 billion years ago, most likely would have formed in a water environment. And this is why in many cases there are aspects of even kind of water-based evolution in humans even. So even though we don't obviously can't breathe in water and we don't act like fish or anything, but aspects to us, our blood, for instance, the plasma in our blood has a saltwater content to it, a salt content, which is very close to ocean content. Evidence for evolution is found in all aspects of the living and of fossil organisms. So the fossil record also points to that. And evidence for evolution can be found certainly in DNA and RNA. So for instance, you have these images in your guided notes if you're looking. Here is just a variety from the fossil record of an elephant's evolution over probably hundreds of thousands of years. I'm not quite sure if this were millions or not, but certainly hundreds of thousands of years, starting with well, and not even starting with, but showing up at least on this slide with a, let's see, Ethereum, and then Triflodon, and then your woolly mammoth, of course, all the way up to your elephant. Structure, function, and homeostasis. Organisms tend to have biological parts that allow for survival. So not all organisms have teeth. Not all organisms have wings or fur, but many do. Many have one or the other or multiples. And these things like teeth or wings or fur or claws, 4 legs, 2 legs, 6 legs, you know, whatever, hair, no hair. All of these things have evolved over time because that allows for the organisms to survive. And so flying, you know, think about flying. The ability to fly allows some organisms to develop, to actually take advantage of other food sources. And so just, you know, whatever it is. Each major group of organisms has a unique biological body part for its survival, like echolocation in bats. So, echolocation. Okay, homeostasis. Homeostasis is a tendency to maintain a stable internal environment. It is not much affected by any external changing conditions. And this is likewise, in our bodies, that whether it's very hot or very cold outside, our body tends to maintain a stable temperature of around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Now this can change a little bit, and it's sometimes a little higher, a little lower, but generally speaking, no matter what the conditions are outside, 98.6 is what we are. You can alter that and certainly end up with a fever, or you can end up with hypothermia if you are outside unprotected in the winter and things along those lines. But generally speaking, with non-dramatic changes, we maintain homeostasis, and most animals and organisms do. Birds in winter can puff up and puff out their feathers to maintain body temperature, even though to us it would be incredibly cold outside, and they magically are able to last the night, last blizzards, and they're flying around the following day. All organisms do respond differently to the environment, and that's, I think, common sense. Values. Flipping my page on my guided notes. In biology, probably more so than some of the sciences at least, we are confronted with a lot of value situations because it is about life. And people view life differently, as far as some people will go out of their way not to step on an ant on a sidewalk, and other people don't care, and other people will seek out stepping on ants on sidewalks. So we all seem to have different ideas and a different philosophy on life. So here are some questions that scientists talk about. Here are questions that people talk about, and in really all societies. So should we clone people? That's a very, very good question. Should we clone people? Should we make a copy of you? Now, think about this, though. If we make a copy of you or we make a copy of me, you're probably 14, 15 years old or so. I'm over 50. So if we copy you, what we would have to do is that copy will not grow in a test tube. We may start it in a lab, but that organism will have to be, your copy, will have to be transferred to a human female, and it will have to be born the normal way, other than maybe a C-section. It'll have to be born and grow and develop inside of a female. Now, with that being said, that child is then born. It is a copy of you, but think about it. You are then 16 years old, and that child is a newborn. So yeah, genetically identical to you, but it's a newborn and it's 16 years behind you. So you don't get a twin. You don't have an automatic twin. That person will always be 16 years behind you. And even though genetically you're identical, they will have completely different experiences. Because even if they come home to your house, your parents who had you 16 years ago, they are different people than they were 16 years ago. They're 16 years older. They could be more tired because they've had children and they're just kind of worn out. Or, they're just different aspects. They're getting ready to retire, whereas 16 years ago they were working strong and all kinds of things. So even that child will have completely different experiences, and in the end, other than looking like you, they will probably not be a lot like you because of those experiences, as far as how nature, or rather, nature plays into it as far as the nurture part, or nurture nature. Yeah. So anyway, should we clone? And there's a conversation about organ harvesting. So imagine if you had a clone of you. Okay, so here's you, and we make a clone of you. Now that clone of you, it's identical to you. You get into an accident and you need a liver. Well, you know what? Your clone has a liver that is literally meant for you. It's identical to your liver, and it's brand new, and it's working. So could we kill your clone, take the liver, and allow you then to have a liver transplant and live longer? There has been discussion about clones. Are they real people? Do they have rights? And could they be used for organ harvesting? I don't know of anybody who would agree with that, but that is honestly a conversation. So talk about values. What do you value? And so big questions. Science certainly investigates it, and everyone can have an opinion on that. What about population control? In 1957, the population of the entire world was about 2.5 billion people, which is certainly quite a bit. Only about, oh my goodness gracious, I guess in say 2000, the year 2000, so that is only 43 years after the fact. We are now at 7.5 billion people. In the course of simply 60 years, we have actually, no, not even 60, I'm sorry. In the course of 40 years, we have actually not only doubled, but we've tripled the population. So population control. Are there just too many people? Something like this coronavirus, pandemic. If we were all spread out a lot more, if there were fewer people on the planet, there'd be less likely that people would contact each other and something like that could spread rapidly. So that brings into the idea of abstinence, where there's no sex, contraceptives, where there is an artificial preventative if people have sex to stop all that, and sterilization. There has literally been talk about forced sterilization, where people would actually be have their equipment shut off. As far as eggs couldn't get into the uterus, I think, and or sperm could not get out and be delivered into the female. So, these are values. It's amazing the conversations that people have about this stuff. And like I said, everyone has an opinion, but China has been invoking population control for a long time now, and they have over 1 billion people in that country alone. And I want to say they had a one-child rule. I don't know if they've relaxed that to a two-child system over the past several years. So it's what do we do? Is there such a thing as too much? Genetic engineering is a big one. Should we genetically engineer people like newborns? It'd be nice to control disease to where your child that's going to be born will be born disease-free. But does it stop there? Could we introduce desired traits? Because I've always wanted a child that is very tall. I mean, I'm 5'5". Wouldn't it be nice to have a child that's going to top 6 feet? So, they're really, they stand out in the crowd. I want them to have, long blonde hair, brown hair, whatever. Could we do that? I want them to have, 2 different colored eyes, one blue and one green, because I think that'd be cool. The child has no decision in that, but what do we do? Could we eliminate undesirable traits? I want them to have tiny feet. I want to have big feet, and then all of a sudden you end up, you've created kind of a clown, and who wants to be that? So genetic engineering. That's scary. It is scary what could potentially be possible. And then global warming. That's we're people, industry, everything. We're really contributing to all this. So what do? It's a value judgment. Do we want to control pollution? Do we want to regulate industry? Do we want to ban cars? Do we want to have everything go to electric cars? So interesting questions. Biology and everyday life. Biologists do not answer these value questions. So a true scientist is not going to weigh in on the values. They're not going to say right. They're not going to say wrong. They're simply going to say, hey, here's what it is. Here's how it's done. And here are the consequences of your action. So if you want to genetically engineer your child, here are the consequences that you can expect. But you would then either regulate with laws or make a decision on your own as to whether, yeah, I think I'm okay with that or no. But biologists simply, as scientists, do not weigh in on the values. They simply, the second thing here, they research the consequences of decisions that society may make on these issues that concern life and the environment. And then people like lawyers, people like people in politics and government, then make laws which are supposedly reflecting the values of the people that voted them in. Okay, so what scientists do is they also provide information to the public and the world governments, and this is especially happening nowadays with all of the reports on COVID-19, where scientists and all labs across the world really are researching this, looking for a vaccine, figuring out the consequences of COVID. Can you get it twice? Or can you develop resistance? And what they do is they find all the information out, they report it to governments, and governments act on that. Should we all wear masks, right? Or should we not wear masks? And those kinds of things. Should we stay 6 feet apart? Or should it be further? Or does it not matter? So scientists find all of this stuff out as best they can. They report to governments, and then governments make decision. Yes, we will wear masks. No, we don't care about the 6 feet. Whatever those questions are. Well, questions like cloning, stem cell research, air pollution, genetic engineering, hunting, the regulation of animals, extinction. Animals are going extinct left and right, it seems, these days, and we are primarily the cause of that. Should we somehow curb our behaviors? Okay, so following along, there are Yep, here we go. I'm sorry, I lost my track in the on the guided notes. Okay, so here we are. So various branches of biology. These are not all of them, by the way. This is just a short list. But just like doctors, biologists can specialize. Maybe I'm very interested in animals, and so I want to go into zoology. Zoology does not necessarily mean I work at a zoo. It simply means that I am an expert on animals. And that's why we call them zoos, by the way, because zooo is, I believe, Latin for animal. So a zoo is just a collection of animals. Zoology is the study of animals. Botany, the study of plants. Paleontology, the study of ancient life. I always thought that was cool. Agriculture, which is actually a branch of biology, even though we think of it as growing food, crops, raising livestock. What it is actually, though, is crops and livestock are being grown or raised from natural resources, and that's incredible biology right there. Ecology, plants, animals, and their relationship to their environments. Cell biology, what is the function of the cell? Genetics, how about hereditary transmission, right? Entomology, the study of insects. Ornithology, birds. Herpetology, reptiles. Ichthyology, always fun name there, ichthyology, the study of fish. And medicine, which is the study of the prevention, cure, and alleviation of disease. A lot of people don't necessarily think of medicine as a branch of biology. They just say it's a science, but it's actually a branch of biology. Okay, then lastly, for this is slide 18 of 20, levels of organization. And so if we wanted to study biology, how could we study it? Well, from the grandest scale, we could study what is called the biosphere. And the biosphere is literally all life and all ecosystems on the earth. So it's everything. That's pretty grand, that's pretty broad, but we could study that. If you wanted to focus in on a little bit, you could focus in on a specific ecosystem. And a specific ecosystem would have the community of animals and organisms, plants, whatever, that would be living in a particular environment that would support them. So it's kind of just a small section of the biosphere. You could, however, focus a little bit further and simply look at a community. Now, a community would be all of the organism populations in a defined area. A community could be like the animals that inhabit Pennsylvania. Granted, it's a lot, and it's a pretty broad area, but that would be a community. What kind of animals would you find in Pennsylvania? Do we find, for instance, mountain lions in Pennsylvania? Some people say yes, but there hasn't been a mountain lion spotted in Pennsylvania in like 100 years or something. So we're pretty sure they're not there anymore. But a community. Or you could focus in on a population specifically. Again, we're getting more defined here. And a population would be one group of organisms only, and that could be, say, white-tailed deer, the white-tailed deer population in Pennsylvania. So then we could focus on an organism. We could take just one white-tailed deer, not the population, but just one living deer, and we could study that. And I don't mean do research on it or anything, just study its habits. It's something very non-invasive. After that, then you get into inside of the living thing. Now we're talking about like groups of cells within one living organism, like the tissues, the organ systems that could be studied. And I don't mean grabbing something alive and dissecting. It's just what parts of it make it alive? What are things that are necessary? What does a deer liver do? Does it do the same thing our livers do? Lastly, we could then, from a group of cells, simply focus on cells themselves, which are the smallest unit of life, and that would be it for life. But we could go further down if we wanted to and look at the molecules that make up the cells. Like a cell itself is made of like a quadrillion cells, or quadrillion molecules, because they are so small. And even though a cell is small, molecules are infinitely small, it seems. But molecules are not alive. They're too small to be considered alive. They don't fit the definition at all. But that's what cells are made of, and cells make up groups of cells, and groups of cells make up an organism. And an organism is a component of a population of like organisms, like one deer out of a whole herd of deers. And deer and fox and rabbits and insects and birds and all of that make up a community in a defined area like Pennsylvania or like just Tioga County. And all of that makes up an ecosystem that may be the northeast of the United States. And all of that is simply a component of the biosphere. So going up to broad and all the way down to very specific. Okay, that tells me this section is done. Your guided notes for this section should also be done. Here's the student learning map information again. And it tells me that the next section up when we go to part 2 of the video will be on the nature of matter. And you'll find this very refreshing because it's going to simply be a quick overview and review of the atomic structure and periodic table stuff. So I'll see you in that presentation. Thank you.